Some of you probably remember in 2015, there was a Michigan college student named Chris Baldwin who went viral. He's a fan of the Michigan Wolverines, and his team was highly ranked. They're playing Michigan State, they're in-state rivals. They're about to win the game, just kind of ice it with one more field goal, and they botched it. There was a fumble, a recovery, and the Michigan State player took it all the way back, and Michigan State, shocked and surprised, with a last minute win. Baldwin's reaction was captured, and it was named the surrender cobra. Do you understand what the surrender? You know what the surrender cobra is? It is when you see your team do something that kind of where you're kind of caught in disbelief and disillusionment. It's hands crossed atop the head, elbows jetting out, face long, shock, disbelief. If you've watched any sports this week, if you watch any sports today, you will just watch at some point in the game, they will pan to the crowd and someone's doing the surrender cobra. Last night, if you were watching, yes, exactly. If you were watching the World Series, Kyle Schwarber hits a home run, it's foul. The next pitch, he hits it. It looks like it's gonna be a home run. The guy catches it right at the fence. They pan to the people in Philadelphia. They're like jumping up and down, and then all of a sudden it's, they just go to the surrender cobra. This is a reaction you will see all throughout. Now, I wish this wasn't the case, but a couple weeks ago, my son and I were sitting in our garage. We're watching Game 4, Dodgers versus Padres. Dodgers have a commanding 3-0 lead, 9 more outs. Game 5 is gonna happen. I say, Trevor, this is awesome. Tomorrow, Sunday, after church, we could race to SoFi and watch the Rams game. Their tickets are only $40. We could sit at the top, watch the Rams game, ultimate sports day, then go across and watch Game 5, Dodgers Padres. We're on our phones looking for tickets, and tragedy strikes. Okay, bullpen just gave up the lead. But it was all of a sudden a 3-0 lead becomes a 5-3 loss, and we're just completely silent. We don't even talk to each other. It's just like, no, in the surrender cobra pose, and we just leave in silence from each other. Now, I wish that life was as simple as that the worst pain in our life, I kind of got to the point afterwards where everyone treated me so nicely the next day. I know people wanted to make fun of it, but everyone was so nice. And I realized part of it is, okay, there is a lot of struggle and pain, real pain in life. This is really not one of them. There are moments where in real life you feel like striking the surrender cobra pose. Your kids do something that you were hoping they wouldn't do. You're like, no. There's something that happens in your marriage or in your career or something where you are kind of taken back. You are caught with disbelief and you find yourself in this pose. Now, I was thinking about, as we've gone through, we've been studying this tiny little book in the Bible called the Book of Ruth, and it's a story of someone who is experiencing all this emptiness, all this disillusionment, all this pain, and the movement. And in some ways, as you teach through a book like this, you cannot help but come face to face with your own pain, your own emptiness. One of the things, as you walked in, chances are you got a puzzle piece that was given to you, and some of you are like, what am I supposed to do with this? Here's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping as we finish the book of Ruth today, what I want you to know is that I don't want you to know the book of Ruth. I want you to know it. I want you to experience it. I want you to be transformed by it, not just informed by it. And so you have a puzzle piece with you, and what I'm inviting you to do is to bring to the front of your mind, to the front of your heart, the front of your life, the part of your life where you might say, God, I just don't know how you're gonna put the pieces back together. This is where I feel empty. This is where I feel confusion. This is where I feel pain. And if you could almost write a word on it that says, this is the puzzle that is spilled out in front of me and I don't know how to put it back together, but I'm looking to you. And I know there's all kinds of things that we have, that have come to our attention. I know for you students, tremendous grief that you've dealt with in this past month. For many of you, relationships that you're trying to figure out and the pain that comes when they're struggling, the career choices. They've talked about the great resignation, and some people are talking about the great regret, where in some ways, what they hoped would be an outward change. Some of you have had awesome opportunities, and some of you thought changing would be what would fix everything. And instead, what you're finding is, not just with jobs, but with a lot of decisions in our life, we kind of look at this X factor and say, if only this X factor could change, then everything would change in my life and I would feel better about things. And then we make the change, and ultimately we find is that, oh, actually it's something much deeper in me. It's not this outward thing, it's something deeper going on in my heart. And I want to invite you this morning to know the story of Ruth and walk in it, because as the story comes full all the way, the story arc kind of comes to a completion. What we're seeing is a story that begins with emptiness, ends with fullness. The disappointment and the pain and the bitterness that we may feel right now, ultimately I want you to see that Ruth is a story of us walking with God and walking with others in these things. And so I want to give you a final big idea that we can look at together as we end this book. And it's this, is that loss does not have to be your life's defining moment. That loss does not have to be your life's defining moment. One of the things that we'll see in the story today is that the story does not end with loss. And the loss that Naomi feels and the loss that Ruth feels don't ultimately become their defining moments. That emptiness and bitterness don't have to be our identity. And I want you to see in the story again that there is a God, sovereign, who walks with us in our lives. He is involved with us. He sees us. And the God who doesn't forget Naomi and Ruth in their pain does not forget you. He sees you as he saw them. And so as we think about how God may put the pieces back together in our puzzle, let me invite you to turn to Ruth chapter 4. Ruth chapter 4. If you're new with us, this tiny little book is tucked away in the Old Testament, 5, 6, 7, seventh book of the Old Testament, tiny little book. If your pages stick together, you'll miss it. But it's a story captured in a very dark time in Israel's history, a time when they're doing what's right in their own eyes. They're forgetting God, who he is and what he's done. But in the darkness of that period of the judges, there's this story that brings light of a God who is still working with his people. And the story of Ruth begins in darkness because, once again, a family who does what's right in their own eyes leave the promised land. They go to a forbidden place. Tragedy strikes. Naomi loses her husband, her 2 sons. She's left with only her 2 daughters-in-law. She encourages them to stay where they are. But Ruth, who is one of them, says to her, kind of one of the beautiful lines of the book of Ruth is chapter 1, verse 16, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, where you lodge, I will lodge. Your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. And this becomes this theme all throughout the book of Ruth, this story of a woman of sacrificial kindness. She gives up her life for her mother-in-law. She cares for her mother-in-law in a beautiful, beautiful way. And for these 2 to survive, we are taken to this custom, this part of God's instruction called gleaning, which is people who owned fields were instructed by God to leave the outside part of the field so that those who are poor or widows or orphans, the foreigner, the immigrant, that they would be cared for. There would be something about God's people, a message sent of God's people, Yahweh's people, that this is who they are. They care, like they would be cared for. And of course, to find a field like that, you have to find a field owner who honors the Lord, who's generous, who's willing to say, I will leave that instead of taking it all for myself. And Ruth finds, as she's living out this new faith, she finds a faithful person's field. But it's not just any person's field. And this is part of the beauty of the story of Ruth, is we're seeing all these what seem to be coincidences really not be coincidences. It's a suggestion from the narrator that God's hand is moving and prompting. And she winds up in the field of Boaz. Boaz, as he gives, invites her into more than just gleaning, as he opens up the generosity of his heart. As she reveals this to Naomi, Naomi realizes, wow, this isn't just any field you fell into. This is, and we're introduced to this theme of the kinsman redeemer. Boaz is one of our family's redeemers, related to her late husband. This is someone who, there's two ideas, the Levir and the Goel, the one who could marry and bless and kind of continue the line of this family, the one who could redeem this family, defend this family, protect this family. But redemption, as we see, always comes with a cost. It's not simply about receiving something, it's about paying something, giving something up to receive something in return. And Boaz is the potential we learn to be that person, but for whatever reason, he never, I guess to say it one way, he never makes the move. He never reaches out to Ruth in any way, although we see in some ways he seems to have great appreciation for who she is. And so chapter 3, we spent a couple weeks looking at chapter 3 because it is a crazy story of a matchmaker coming up with a plan and trying to figure out all these unique ways, ultimately where Ruth could propose to Boaz, invite him to be their kinsman redeemer. The plan could go really wrong. And the whole time you're reading it, the writer, the narrator is kind of trying to help you feel the tension of this story. This story could go bad at any moment. And when Boaz shows his affirmation, you kind of have this sigh of relief. Whew. And then he says, but. And you're like, no, buts. I took all the energy, all my emotional energy just to get to this point. And the story takes another twist. While I am a redeemer, I am not the redeemer. There's someone in front of me. And so now we have to wait. We have to see, will this other redeemer step in? But wait a second, you've developed this character of Boaz. We love Boaz. We're rooting for Boaz. We're team Boaz. Hashtag Boaz. Like everything is about him. And chapter 4, as we saw last week, he goes to the city gate. He goes to that relative. He makes a presentation. You can redeem. And the guy says, that's great. But you have to redeem at a cost. You have to take on Ruth the Moabite, Naomi. No, thank you. And so Boaz becomes their redeemer. And it's this beautiful kind of end of the story. And it feels as if the narrator's brought everything together, but there's one last thing I want us to see. There's not only redemption for Ruth and for Boaz, but we have to see in this last part also the redemption that comes to Naomi's life as well. Verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Now, the narrator takes 9 months, crams it into one line, but there's a lot that's happening in this one line. We see the progression of Ruth. She's no longer the Moabite. She's no longer this foreigner. She's no longer this lower servant. She's Boaz's wife. There's this new family that's being created. But we also see the miraculous work of God, the consummation of the marriage, but what we are trying to see, what he wants us to see is the technical term is that the Lord gave Ruth conception. Now, this isn't a Mary, Jesus kind of Holy Spirit kind of no involvement. This is, I guess this is a way of what Justin was talking about. This is co-laboring with God. They have to do their part in this, but God is the one who opens her womb. We know that before in chapter 1, there's 10 years of barrenness. And so there's a whole idea of everything that we see of emptiness in chapter 1 being fulfilled in chapter 4. Verse 14, it says that the women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." Now, this is a beautiful moment because in some ways, if you think back at the beginning of chapter 1, when Ruth and Naomi come back to Bethlehem, the women there are asking, is this Naomi? And Naomi is so broken that all she can say is, don't call me that any longer. Naomi, which means pleasant, she says, call me Mara, which means bitter. And she talks about all that she's lost. I went away full. I've come back empty. The Lord has taken everything from me. I mean, you can hear the words in her. You can hear it in the tone of her voice. She is a broken woman. And now, chapter 4, they're praising God together on her behalf. They're praying over her. There's you notice the first part of this prayer is praise to the Lord. It is a praise for the Lord's kindness on behalf of redeeming Naomi and Ruth. There's a prayer for the child and the blessing that the child will bring to them. And then the third thing you see in the prayer is that there's this declaration of confidence, that there will be this sense that he will be this restorer of their life. Their loss has been redeemed. There's future, there's hope. Her womb is open. And the one who was bitter and empty is being told that there's this life. And notice where the life is found. There's this interesting phrase that they praise Ruth and they describe her as being better than 7 sons. This idea of seven in perfection, 7 sons, you couldn't have a better deal. And they say, what you have in Ruth, this Moabite daughter-in-law, is you've been blessed more than the woman who has 7 sons. That what we see as the ultimate blessing, you have received so much more in her. Ruth, this one who's given herself in sacrificial kindness, what a blessing she has been. Verse 16, then it says that try to picture this. Any of you who are moms or grandmas, try to imagine Naomi. Think back to Naomi, right? Think back to Naomi, broken, bitter, and try to imagine what her face would look like in verse 16. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. It says that she takes the child and she becomes a caregiver of this child. Now, I don't know what term you want, grandma, nana, Grammy, granny, Oma, I don't know, whatever you're gonna debate and kind of come up with, but there's this picture of her finally, after all this time, holding in her arms. I was thinking back, it was such a tender moment watching Kim's mom, my mom, hold our son Andrew for the first time, the way that they just lit up. I can't believe my child's child, and they're holding him in their arms and they just lit up. And I try to imagine that in Naomi's face and Naomi's heart, the way her heart explodes with love over this child, that they could describe her only as one who would care for him. And everyone is giving praise. And the emphasis you see in these verses is over and over again, announcing this child, announcing this birth, announcing new life. And it's meant to bring you all the way full circle from chapter 1, famine, emptiness, barrenness, and now there's birth, life, hope, future. Everything is pointing to where God has brought them. And the celebration that Naomi has a son, you're like, wait a second, I thought Ruth had the baby. She does, but part of what they're trying to do is bring Naomi's story full circle. Her story is being fulfilled in this birth as well. And the repetitiveness again and again is to help you see the climax of this story. And then verse 18 is very interesting, a genealogy, a list of kind of the ancestry. It says, this then is the family of the line of Perez. Perez is the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahashon. Nahashon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz. Boaz, the father of Obed. Obed, the father of Jesse. Jesse, the father of David. This is King David. And the genealogy traces it to King David. Now, interesting kind of tangent that we see in this. We'll start Christmas stuff in a month. I know you haven't even had Halloween yet, but sorry to be Walmart right now, but just think ahead to Christmas, right? Do you ever think about why it is that Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem? You say, well, the Romans made them go because there was a census and they have to go. Right, but you understand why. Because this is their family line, their descendants. This story of Ruth is why they are going back to Bethlehem. In fact, in Matthew chapter 1, this same genealogy is quoted, but it has a little wrinkle to it. See if you notice. Verse 5 of chapter 1 in Matthew says, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of King David, and then skipping all the way to verse 16, Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, Mary, the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And all through this, what you see is not just the kingly line of David, but the kingly line of Jesus. Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ. Now there's this interesting note, if you look at the verse, go back to that slide 1 second, John. If you see verse 5, it says, Boaz, I don't know if you saw who his mom was. Boaz's mom is Rahab. Man, that one's juicy too, and I just want to tell you, I can't tell you about it yet, but come on December 4th and we'll tell you all about Rahab as well. But it's such an amazing thing of God, it's just a story of redemption, God redeeming. And so as we close out this book, let me just give you a couple things that maybe you can take with you from the book of Ruth. One is this, is that we walk with a God who comforts us in our sorrows. We walk with a God who comforts us in our sorrows. This is a story in which we're reminded that God does not give up on Naomi, he doesn't give up on Ruth, and he doesn't give up on you. God walks with us in our sorrows. I find when I'm counseling someone or meeting with someone who's going through a hard thing in their life, a lot of times I feel like the Spirit takes me to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, where it describes God this way, that God who is compassionate comforts us in our troubles. See, God, whose very nature is compassion, that's just who he is, cannot help but enter into your life when you're struggling and comfort you, because that is who he is. He is the one who walks with us and comforts us in our sorrows. Now, the power of that verse is actually, I think, what comes next, that he says that so that, here's why God comforts you, so that you can then comfort others with the comfort you've received from God. That God is such a good comforter. If you will allow him to do the work, as Justin suggested, if you will co-labor with him and follow his lead as he's leading you through this, he will actually bring you to a point where you will come alongside someone else and be able to offer them comfort. You actually become the agent of God's comfort in their life. This is who God is. This is what he does. Now, one of the hard things that I don't think any of us like to admit, but we find to be true, is that we often experience God in a much deeper way when we struggle. That our faith grows in the valley times of our life. That resiliency is built in our life because of the fire and because of the pounding. And C.S. Lewis, who wrote a book called The Problem of Pain, said this. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but he shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And it's hard to imagine sometimes that in these painful seasons, that God feels, there's a way in which God might feel very close to you. And I've tried to figure this out, like why sometimes do I find myself growing closer to the Lord in some of those hard times and some of those dark times. And I think one of the reasons is that we walk with a God who has suffered for us. It's not just that he comforts us, but we have to remember the one who comforts us has suffered for us. Jesus invites us into God's presence because of this, because of what he's gone through for us. He's been tempted in every way, yet without sin. And so you're invited he's a high priest. He's highly empathetic for you in your weakness. Jesus gets it. I mean, this is the beautiful part of, I hope you'll see it again as we talk about this at Christmas, is that In Jesus, God comes near. God takes on flesh. God enters into your world. God enters into our pain. He understands this thing. He's not so infinitely beyond us that he can't feel those things with you. But the truth is that he has suffered. He suffered to bring us to himself, to bring us to God. This is who God is. Think about this. There's this moment when Jesus, the women go to the tomb. The tomb is empty. They are told by these angels to go back to tell the disciples. The disciples come. There's this whole, Luke 24 tells this incredible, it's one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible. Everyone's kind of stirring. These two people leave. They're walking on this road. Jesus comes and walks with them. They have this experience. They run back. They come to the room where everyone's hiding, right? They're in this upper room. Doors are locked. Everyone's hiding. They do the secret knock or whatever they do. They come inside. They're like, we saw Jesus. Like, I know Peter saw Jesus. Everyone's talking about it. And then all of a sudden, Jesus is there with them. And it says that they are so blown away by this that it's too good to be true. They almost can't believe it, because how can you believe what's happening? We're seeing it, but we don't even know how to get our hands around. This is the most incredible thing that's ever happened in the world. And at some point, Jesus must have calmed them all down, because he says, does anybody have something to eat? They chuckle, they get him something to eat, and then it says that he begins to explain the scriptures. So think about this. You're getting a survey of Old Testament, that's their Bible, is the Old Testament, and he's telling them the whole story, but he's telling them the story of God through the lens of his life. He wants them to see, as Paul would say, that he died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose from the dead according to the scriptures. This is the golden thread woven through the entire story of the Old Testament, is about the Messiah, the Savior, dying for us and raising again as Lord of all. So think about this. He gets to the book of Ruth. And he says, you guys remember the book of Ruth? And they're like, no, it's really tiny. I always read through it really fast. No, come on. Someone knows the book of Ruth. And he says, where do you see me in the book of Ruth? Silence. Then maybe one of the quiet disciples who never gets mentioned raises his hand and has the right answer. You're the Redeemer. Bingo. You got it, Bartholomew. I'm the kinsman redeemer of that story. I'm Boaz. I am that person. I'm the one who has redeemed you. I am your redeemer. And we begin to understand that this idea of redemption, but redemption always comes with a cost. See, for us, for Jesus to redeem us, you have to understand that you are held by sin and death and hell and evil. These things that have power over us, that enslave us, that enchain you. So how will you become free? Well, someone has to pay a price. The Redeemer has to pay a price to redeem you. And Peter describes it this way, that Christ suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. Jesus redeems us through his body. He frees you from the captivity of sin and death and evil and hell. By the giving of his life, these crosses remind us that you were bought with a price. You were redeemed with a price. Do you know this Redeemer? Do you walk with this Redeemer? I mean, be honest, who is going to redeem you from hell and from death and from evil and from sin? And the beautiful story of the Bible is we do not have that power. We do not have that ability, but God in his love has sent his son, and Jesus has given himself as the price of our redemption. You've been bought at a cost. And if you have not surrendered your life to him today, my hope is in a few minutes that will be exactly what you'll do. I remember hearing that for the first time as a high school student and thinking, that's just so amazing. I can't believe that God loves me like that. But the last thing I want you just to see is this, is that I hope you'll take from the book of Ruth is that we walk with others in their loss. We walk with others in their loss. One of the themes I hope you've seen again and again is this idea of kindness. Now, when the book of Ruth speaks about kindness, it doesn't mean being polite and gentle. You're at a restaurant and the waitress gets your order wrong and you go, oh, it's okay, I'll just eat it like this. Like that's nice, that's polite. But that's not the kind of kindness that the Bible's talking about here. What it's talking about is this idea of sacrificing, of giving yourself for someone else. It's Ruth laying down her life to care for her mother-in-law. And Boaz can get to the point where he can commend her and say, do you know when the people get together, when they talk about you, what can't leave their lips is your kindness. The sacrifice that you've made for Naomi, the things you're willing to do to bless this woman, it has not gone unnoticed. And we see this kindness in Boaz, we see it in Naomi, but friends, we know this to be true of Jesus. It's sacrificial kindness is what marks Jesus, our Savior and our Lord. And if you claim to follow him, then you have to understand something. When you come to Jesus in faith, you say, Jesus, I give you my life. Forgive me of my sins. Fill me with your Spirit. You are inviting into your life the Spirit of God who has sacrificial kindness, who gives himself for someone else. And the Spirit cannot help but prompt you into things and lead you into things in which you are invited to live with that kind of kindness. I pray that when people talk about us here, when they talk about Beachpoint, they will talk about your kindness, your sacrificial love for others. We have to be with others in their loss with empathy and not quick solutions. We need to grieve with those who grieve, mourn with those who mourn. We want to be practical in our care. We want to do the Ruth kind of things for people when they're in hard places. But we want to be the kind of people who care. And so as we close today, I just want to invite you to think about how you might respond to the book of Ruth. And your story, like their story, can be the story about your response to loss. Loss means grief. I was listening to a story of a guy named Jerry Sitzer, a college professor. His minivan was hit, and he lost 3 generations in the car accident. His mom, his wife, and his daughter. Just an unfathomable amount of grief. And he wrote a book years later to talk about his experience called A Grief Disguised. And he said this, the experience of loss does not have to be the defining moment of our lives. Instead, the defining moment can be our response to the loss. It's not what happens to us that matters so much as what happens in us. And he began to speak of the grace that he experienced. He says, gifts of grace come to all of us, but we must be ready to see and willing to receive these gifts. It will require a kind of sacrifice, the sacrifice of believing that however painful our losses, life can still be good in a different way than before, but nevertheless good. And I love his honesty. He says, I will never recover from my loss, and I will never get over missing the ones I lost, but I still cherish life. I will always want the ones I lost back again. I will long for them with all my soul, but I still celebrate the life I have found because they are gone. I have lost, but I have also gained. I lost the world I loved, but I gained a deeper awareness of grace. That grace has enabled me to clarify my purpose in life and rediscover the wonder of the present moment. The story of Ruth is a reminder that God can meet us in our emptiness with his fullness. That does not mean you will not have scars in this life. We all know we will go through life with scars, but those scars don't have to be the end of our story. Loss does not have to be the defining moment of our story. This is the story of Ruth. And so as we end today, I want you to hear the story of a young girl. Her name was Azrin, a Kurdish girl that grew up in northern Iran. 6 of her cousins were killed by the military, the Iranian forces there. And she said her earliest memories were really just learning about, grew up in a cemetery because her mother would go to mourn all the time. She said at the age of 16, she was accused of crimes she didn't commit and forced to sign a statement of guilt. She said, I've done nothing wrong, but they held me guilty. They'd killed my cousins, and now they're accusing me of crimes I had not committed. And so she decided to do the very things that she was told to confess to. And so she traveled to the mountains of Iraq to join the Kurdish militia. And she said up to that point, she had dutifully attended mosque, she'd prayed to Allah, but she had never heard his voice. The Kurdish militia were communists. They didn't believe in God's existence. And she began to wonder if this was what reality was. So she gave God an ultimatum. Either you speak to me in the next 7 days, or I'll have nothing to do with you. She said, I'm giving you 7 nights, or I will go gar. This is a Persian word for being permanently upset with someone. On the 7th night, with the deadline approaching, she reminded God, you better say something today. At night when she went to sleep, she had a dream. And in the dream, she was in this vast reception room and feeling very alone. And then she noticed a familiar face. She sensed and knew that it was Jesus. He was leaning against a wall. She knew him as Jesus, the prophet from the Quran. Holy and honored, but not the Son of God, as she understood him. And she said he was standing so close that I could feel his breath, and all around him was this brilliant light. And so nervously, she approached him and she said, I'm here to talk to God. He looked straight back at me and said the strangest thing, talk. No, she protested, you don't understand, I need to talk to God. Again, Jesus looked at her and said, talk. And then very slowly he repeated the most astounding phrase, I am God. I am God. I am God. She said, as I heard this, all doubt drained away from my tired heart. She said, we talked and we talked and we talked. And I poured out my heart to him, to God and Jesus. And for the first time in my life, I experienced God speaking back into my life. She said when she awoke from the dream, she had gone to speak to her religious leader, and he scoffed at her that Jesus was not the Son of God. She went to her family, told about her experience, and they just laughed at her. So she wound up going to a park and sitting there trying to ponder what she had experienced, and a stranger walked up to her, handed her a Bible. She had never seen a Bible, let alone one in her own language. He invited her to go to church with her, and there in that, she heard a preacher speak of a God who loved her. Afterwards, she went to the park and she began to read the Bible, and she came to the part of the Bible where she realized this is what Jesus was getting at in her dream. John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. She understood why he kept saying to her, talk. I'm here, talk. She said, sitting there in that park, she acknowledged Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and as she did so, she experienced this unfamiliar sense of hope flooding her body, displacing all the years of despair. She changed her direction in her life. She didn't wind up being part of the military. She decided, I don't want to take life, I want to give life. So as she grew in her faith, she became a church planter. Now, this young girl has planted 5 churches in one of the most unreached, unengaged parts of the world. She's started what we would call a disciple-making movement. It's what we're praying for Taylor and Heidi and Tammy and Amy and Eric, who are all our people who are living in this region and who are trying to share the gospel. And you think about it, how did God speak to her? Through a dream, through a preacher, through the Bible. And he filled her emptiness. Now she lives a life of sacrificial kindness, giving herself so other people will now know this God who wants to know them as well. And so as we end Ruth, the invitation is this: will you walk with God? The God who meets you in your pain, who meets you in your emptiness and leads you to fullness. And will you walk with others in their pain, in their emptiness? And so we're gonna sing this final song. It's just a beautiful song to kind of acknowledge the struggle, to acknowledge the piece of the puzzle that makes no sense. To say, I don't know how to put the pieces together, but it's well with my soul to say, you, the one who calms the wind and waves, you're the one I'm trusting, you're the one I'll follow in this. So here's what we're gonna do a little differently. During the final song, I'm gonna invite you to place your puzzle piece at the cross. We're gonna stand, there's pens up here at the front. If you didn't get a puzzle piece, there's pieces here at the front in the blue baskets. But what I want you to do is when you're ready to come to the front, to write on the piece a word that characterizes where you feel that feeling of emptiness. Where you feel in some ways, God, I don't know how you're gonna put this together, but here it is. And I wanna give kind of an old-fashioned kind of Baptist invitation that kind of goes through our roots of our church here. But if you've never committed your life to Jesus Christ, here's what I'm gonna invite you to do, as some have already done this morning. What I want you to write on the puzzle pieces, I want you to write your first and last name. In essence, to say to the Lord as you place that at the cross, here's my life. Jesus, save me, fill me, lead me. I'm yours. And let him do that work. And so let's stand together, let's sing this final song, and when you're ready, you can bring your piece, a puzzle, to the cross.